Welcome back, everyone, to our podcast. I am your friend, Dr. James. I am doing this podcast to create awareness on the free grace theology. We are continuing our deep dive into one of the most critical topics in theology, the nature of faith. If you were with us for the last session, you know we started asking the big question, what exactly is faith? Is it a gift divinely dropped into us, or is it a human response to evidence? Before we jump in, I want to give credit where credit is due. The material we are covering today, the historical analysis, the lexical deep dives, is sourced from the lectures and research of Dr. Ken Wilson. I want to acknowledge him right up front and let you know that much of what I'm sharing in this podcast comes directly from his scholarship. When we get to specific illustrations or historical connections, please keep in mind that these insights are coming from Dr. Wilson's extensive work. So, picking up where we left off, we're discussing faith. As we look into faith, let's look at faith alone and the definitions. As I mentioned in the last session, faith, belief, and trust, they are all the same thing. In the Greek, they are all pistis. They are all faith. But let's look at how our English dictionaries define this and see what they do with it. First, you have Webster's dictionary. It defines faith as unquestioning belief that does not require proof or evidence. Now, biblically speaking, that is a wrong definition. We know we have to have evidence. Hebrews 11:1 calls faith the evidence of things not seen. And notice that Webster uses belief to define faith, which is a bit of a tautology, defining a word with itself. Next, Webster defines belief as the state of believing, conviction or acceptance that certain things are true or real. Now, I like that. I think that is an accurate definition of belief. And then trust is defined as a firm belief or confidence. So, do you see that? Faith, belief, believe, trust, they are all circular in their understanding in English, just as they are in the Greek with the word pistis. They are essentially the same concept. Now, I want to take you into the academic side for a moment. I want to look at a lexicon. This is the most famous lexicon used in biblical studies, BDAG, the Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament and other early Christian literature. It's named after the authors Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich. I want you to notice something very subtle but dangerous that happened between editions. If you look at the second edition of BDAG, the older one, it defines pistio, to believe, as to believe in, trust of religious belief, in addition to being convinced that he exists and that his revelations or disclosures are true. Okay, that's standard, but watch what happens in the third edition, the latest one. They changed the definition to entrust oneself to an entity in complete confidence. Believe in, trust, with implication of total commitment to the one who is trusted. Did you catch that? They snuck in the implication of total commitment. Why? Because the authors of the latest edition tend to hold to a more lordship salvation understanding. They put that in there without any lexical basis. There's no foundation for it in the Greek text itself. It just slid in there. Dr. Wilson points this out to warn us. We have to be very careful even when trusting lexicons because they are written by people with biases. There is no unwarranted basis for adding total commitment to the definition of belief. So if faith is just belief, where did we get this complex idea of faith having multiple parts? Well, Dr. Wilson highlights a common view held by Calvinists, and interestingly, it wasn't in the literature until the Reformation. It started with Melanchthon. Melanchthon was an associate of Martin Luther at Wittenberg in Germany. He came up with the idea that faith has three components. According to Melanchthon, faith is 1. Notitia, a cognitive, mental understanding. 2. A sensus, mental assent or agreement that the information is true. 3. Fiducia, personal trust or commitment. Here's the problem. There is nothing in Scripture that says faith must include a commitment. That is Melanchthon's understanding. It comes from Latin, not from Greek. You cannot find that tripartite distinction in the Greek New Testament. It's a conjecture, a speculation invented during the Reformation to explain what faith is. Yet, it is commonly used today as if it were Bible truth. So why did they do this? It goes back to a struggle in Germany between two groups, the Confessionalists and the Pietists. The Confessionalists said, all you have to do is believe. The Pietists said, no, you have to have good works. Now, to be fair, some Confessionalists went too far. Niklas von Amsdorf, an associate at Wittenberg, actually said that good works were hurtful to the Christian life because they could foster a doctrine of justification by works. That is, wow, that is over the top. We at Grace School of Theology believe good works are helpful to the Christian life. But even though he was wrong on that point, he was a man trying to defend grace. On the other side, you had the early Lutheran Pietists, Johann Arndt, Philipp Spener, and August Franke. Their goal was genuine. It was pure. They were saying, let's get off of just believing something intellectually and let's do something about it. Let's put feet to our faith. And we agree, we should do so. The problem, however, is how they did it. Listen to Johann Arndt writing in his book, True Christianity. He says, we gladly acknowledge that we must be saved only and alone through faith. Far be it from us to depart even one finger's breadth from this teaching. For as a fruit of our faith, our works are connected with the gratitude which we owe to God. That sounds great, right? Arndt, Spener, and Franke completely agreed with the doctrine of justification by faith alone. But Dr. Wilson points out that their impact wasn't the result of a different view of justification, but of a different definition of the faith that effects justification. And this problem traces back, unsurprisingly, to Martin Luther. Luther was an Augustinian monk. He was heavily influenced by Augustine and Augustine's errors. Let's look at what Luther wrote in his preface to the Epistle to the Romans. He's speaking here about false faith versus true faith. He says, faith, however, is a divine work in us. It kills the old Adam and makes altogether different men of us. Oh, it is a living, busy, active, mighty thing, this faith, and it is impossible for it not to do good works incessantly. Impossible for it not to do good works. Wow, that is quite a statement, Martin. But where do you get that biblically? You don't. There is no biblical basis for that understanding. The Pietists took this and ran with it. They held that the new birth must necessarily manifest itself in a new pattern of life. In other words, if your behavior doesn't change, you aren't really justified. They denied that good works are necessary for justification, but they put a new stress on them as attributes which necessarily follow active faith. They saw an intimate connection between justification and sanctification. Basically, they argued that the faith which justifies is also the faith which sanctifies. So, if God gives the gift of faith, they argued, He is also going to produce a new holiness in us practically. This is the origin of the modern lordship understanding of faith. It puts the works inside the definition of faith itself. Here is Dale Brown on understanding Pietism. He notes that Spener, the Pietist, went beyond orthodoxy when he hinted that such works must necessarily follow. He referred to good works as a conditio sine qua non, a necessary condition. He's saying those good works are within the faith and they have to come out to show the faith was real. Dr. Wilson notes that logically, biblically, and experientially, they concluded that sanctification will follow and give evidence of justification. Now, their contemporaries, the Confessionalists, attacked them for this. They charged the Pietists with overturning the Reformation and reintroducing works as a condition for justification, just like the Roman Catholics had done. And honestly, the charge was accurate. One of the key contributions of the Pietists was the insistence that justifying faith is fiducia, commitment, rather than just assensus, mental assent. They insisted that biblical faith is more than merely agreeing with truth. It is a personal faith that lays hold of Christ and results in regeneration and sanctification. To prove this wasn't a new invention, Spener kept quoting Luther's preface to Romans. That quote about faith being a living, busy, active thing. Luther had backed himself into a corner. He was the champion of faith alone. But he was attacked by people saying, if you teach that, people will never do good works. So he essentially backpedaled and said, "Oh my, but this faith will produce works because it's a gift of God." Spener was actually accused of teaching justification by works by the Orthodox Lutheran theologians of his day. And looking at his writings, he was guilty. Listen to this quote from Spener regarding drunkenness. "This sin, drunkenness too, must once and for all be renounced if they are to be children of God. If some advance the argument that drunkenness cannot be so grave a sin, because if it were, there would be very few true Christians among us, I shall accept the conclusion." Spener is saying, if you get drunk, you are not a Christian. You are going to hell. That is works justification. Dr. Wilson makes a powerful point here. The Pietists weren't crazy. They were reacting. But they ended up saying, no one will be justified other than those who are intent upon sanctification. This takes us right back to Roman Catholic ideas. That justification is a long process, not a moment in time. If you can't be justified unless you are being sanctified, you have destroyed the finished work of the gospel. The emphasis on free grace justification by the Confessionalists resulted in a reactionary redefinition of faith by the Pietists to guarantee that churchgoers would do good works. They essentially said, we don't want this faith alone stuff. That's too dangerous. They'll just sit around. So we will redefine faith to include good works. Let's bring this to the modern day. R.C. Sproul, a very famous Calvinist theologian, laid out these formulas in his book, Faith Alone. He says the difference between Rome and the Reformation is this. The Roman view, faith plus works, justification. The Protestant view, faith, justification plus works. Sproul then admits, neither view eliminates works. Did you hear that? Neither view eliminates works. The Catholics say you need faith and works. The Protestants, following Luther and the Pietists, say faith equals justification plus works. Where are the works in the Protestant view? They are hidden inside the definition of faith, so the Catholics are open about it. The Protestants hide the works in the definition, but both end up in the same place. You must have good works to get to heaven. That should cause us to pause and say, wait a minute, is that really true? Is that what we believe about faith alone? I want to close this session with a quote from Gordon Clark. Now, Clark is not a free grace theologian, but look at what he says about this problem. Faith, rather than being recognized as belief of a statement, is not in accord with Scripture. It regards faith as trust in or commitment to a person rather than belief of a proposition. Even Gordon Clark recognized that redefining faith to include commitment and works is dangerous. It shifts us away from believing a promise to measuring our performance. So, we have a problem. Luther and the Pietists started a fire by redefining faith to solve the problem of lazy Christians, but they ended up smuggling works back into the gospel. In our next podcast, we are going to continue this and find out, how do we resolve this? How do we get back to a biblical understanding of faith? Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.